Before there were chains, before ships set sail across stormy seas bearing stolen sons and daughters, there was glory, undeniable, radiant glory. There was brilliance in the hearts of black kings and queens. There was power etched into the stones of palaces, into the gold-laced soil of empires, into the minds of philosophers, warriors, and visionaries who ruled not with cruelty, but with wisdom, order, and a profound sense of divine destiny. Today we peel back the veil of distortion, not to dwell in bitterness, but to rise in understanding. For the truth will not only set us free, it will remind us that we were never meant to be bound in the first place. Africa was not born in poverty. It was not born in chains. It was not born in the shadows. Africa was born with light. It was born with a song in its soul and a sword in its hand. In the lush valleys of the Nile and the heartlands of Mali, greatness was carved into the very fabric of existence. Before the colonizers came with maps and missions, there were already empires built on mathematics, astronomy, theology, and diplomacy. These were not forgotten lands. They were silenced lands, lands where the sun rose over temples, older than any European castle, lands where knowledge passed from one generation to another, not through books alone, but through memory, rhythm, and voice. The African mind was not asleep. It was calculating, engineering, designing futures long before the world gave it permission to dream. Can you see it? Can you hear it? The sound of feet on palace floors, the sound of scholars debating in Timbuktu, the sound of builders shaping cities out of stone without mortar, cities that still stand when others have crumbled. The empire of Ghana, where gold was so abundant it was said to be as common as dust. The kingdom of Kush, a land of queens who commanded armies and shaped destinies. The majesty of Mansa Musa, whose generosity redefined the very meaning of wealth. When he journeyed to Mecca, he gave so much gold that it shook the economies of the regions he passed. That wasn't just generosity, it was sovereignty, it was influence, it was divine stewardship. We must remember these truths, not just for pride, but for restoration. You see, when you teach a people only about their chains, they learn to accept bondage as part of their identity. But when you remind them of their crowns, of their thrones, of their sacred beginnings, they walk differently. They speak differently. They dare to rise again. And that is the call in this moment, not just to awaken minds, but to reawaken the spirit, to stir the sleeping giant of black history and breathe life into the embers of forgotten glory. This isn't mythology, this is memory, and memory is power. Africa was not isolated, its kingdoms were global. Its impact stretched from the ports of the Mediterranean to the far corners of Asia. Trade routes, diplomatic alliances, cultural exchanges, all these flowed through Africa like lifeblood. Black sailors navigated coastlines. Black architects built wonders. Black physicians healed bodies. Black poets spoke to the soul. These were not people waiting to be discovered. They had already discovered themselves, and their self-awareness birthed greatness. Why does this matter? Because history is not a collection of facts. It's a mirror, and for too long the mirror has been cracked, distorted, even hidden. A child who grows up seeing themselves only through the lens of struggle will believe that struggle is all they are capable of. But when that same child sees their ancestors as visionaries, as inventors, as kings and queens, something shifts inside of them. The chains fall off, not just from their wrists, but from their minds. And when the mind is free, the body follows. The rise of black kings and kingdoms teaches us that strength is not new to us. Excellence is not foreign to us. Intelligence is not imported. It is inherited. We come from those who built before they were broken. We come from thinkers who calculated the stars before they were told they were less than human. That kind of heritage cannot be erased. It can only be rediscovered. And so we look back, not to stay there, but to gather strength, to gather truth, to gather purpose. We must teach our children not just about slavery, but about sovereignty. Not just about oppression, but about origin. Let the textbooks speak of Nubia and Axum as much as they speak of Europe. Let them tell of the great Zimbabwe, where stone towers still stand as a testament to human ingenuity. Let them speak of the libraries of Timbuktu, where knowledge was sacred and scrolls were protected like treasure. Let them know that before they were called slaves, they were called royalty. Let us no longer accept half the story. Let us no longer tolerate silence where there should be song. Let the world hear the names of Shaka Zulu, Queen Nzinga, Askia the Great, not as side notes, but as central figures in the human journey. This is not about rewriting history, it is about reclaiming it. Because when a tree forgets its roots, it dies. But when it remembers, it thrives. We are not here to be bitter, we are here to be better informed. The journey ahead is not only about restitution, it is about resurrection. To bring back what was buried, not in soil but in silence. And we must be the voice that breaks that silence. Because every generation carries a torch, and ours must burn with the fire of truth, of clarity, of courage. We must teach, we must tell, we must testify. Not just in classrooms, but at dinner tables, in films, in music, in movements, in every heartbeat that seeks justice through knowledge. The rise of black kingdoms tells us that power is not given, it is realized, it is remembered, it is reclaimed. If you feel forgotten, remember Ghana. If you feel voiceless, remember Nubia. If you feel powerless, remember Mali. And if you feel directionless, look to the stars just as your ancestors did. And know that their wisdom still flows through your veins. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of remembrance. And remembrance is where healing starts. Before there were chains, there were crowns. Before there was bondage, there was brilliance. And that brilliance still lives. It lives in you. Walk with it, speak with it, rise with it. For history is not just what happened, it is what lives on when you choose to remember. So don't just listen to this message, carry it. Let it echo in your choices. Let it reflect in your work. Let it live in your love for self and others. Because the rise of black kings and kingdoms was not just a historical moment, it was a divine reminder that black excellence is not an exception, it is the origin. And when we return to our origin, we return to our power. Before the world drew borders and branded identities with the mark of servitude, before languages were stolen and names were replaced with numbers, there was an origin that carried purpose. Not just existence, but excellence. Not merely survival, but sovereignty. The blood that flows through the veins of the African diaspora is not the blood of victims, it is the blood of visionaries, rulers, architects of culture and civilization. When we begin to understand the true beginning, when we pull back the curtain of miseducation and look deeply into the stories of those who came before, we do more than learn, we awaken. There is something transformative that happens when a person discovers that their ancestors were not just passengers on slave ships, but masters of empires. That long before they were called property, they were priests, warriors, astronomers, and merchants. Their presence was not only powerful, it was sacred. There were societies where black men and women shaped the laws, protected the sacred, wrote the texts, and carried wisdom that would later be repackaged and claimed by others. We cannot overstate the spiritual and psychological shift that occurs when this truth is embraced, not as a symbol, but as a lived inheritance. For too long, the descendants of Africa have been forced to inherit trauma without truth. The stories they were told in school books began with chains, with cotton fields, with poverty and pain. But these were chapters inserted without context, masking the volumes of excellence that preceded them. A crown was traded for shackles in the retelling, and generations were raised believing they came from nothing. But royalty does not vanish, it sleeps. And this is the hour of awakening. To be connected to the greatness of Africa's kingdoms is not about nostalgia. It is about justice, healing, and reclamation. Reconnecting with one's bloodline isn't only about heritage, it's about identity. Knowing that the same blood that once ruled in Kemet, governed in Benin, and traded gold in Ghana still pulses in today's generation gives a young black child something they've been denied for too long: the permission to see themselves as powerful. It is not a coincidence that colonial systems worked so hard to erase these truths. You do not try to erase what is weak. You try to erase what is divine. Africa's civilization stood as proof that black excellence was not an accident, but a norm. From the art in Noach to the pyramids of Sudan, from the queens who led armies to the sages who calculated the stars, the black identity was filled with divine intelligence and fearless grace. When this is remembered, the narrative changes, and when the narrative changes, the future is reshaped. This reconnection is not only for those living in Africa, it is for every member of the diaspora, from the streets of Kingston to the boroughs of London, from Harlem to Haiti, from Brazil to the Bronx. The world's most displaced people must become its most recentering. That recentering begins with truth. It begins when a child of the diaspora stops asking, "Where do I come from?" with shame, and starts saying, "I know who I am." With confidence. That confidence does not come from fantasy, it comes from history. When we tell our children that they are heirs of greatness, it is not empty motivation, it is an invitation to identity. It is a reminder that they are not lost, they are just distant, and distance can be closed. That journey back to the root is not just physical, it is spiritual. It is in learning the stories of the Ashanti, the wisdom of the Yoruba, the power of Ethiopia, the pride of Zulu, the brilliance of Mali. These were not disconnected tribes, they were nations, united in vision and divine alignment. The mind of a people can only rise as far as their memory will take them. If you feed a child a broken story, they will build a broken dream. But if you restore the full picture, suddenly the impossible feels within reach. The diaspora has carried wounds for centuries, but buried beneath those wounds is gold, ancestral gold, that cannot be mined, only remembered. It is our duty now to dig for that memory, to tell it loudly, to teach it faithfully, and to live it boldly. There is no freedom without truth. There is no healing without memory, and there is no future without identity. The connection between the African diaspora and its royal bloodlines is not a romantic idea, it is the missing piece in the puzzle of restoration. It is the reason the world has seen revival in music, culture, politics, and faith whenever black people begin to rediscover their value. The rhythm is still in us. The call to build, lead, protect, and create is not new. It is inherited, it is ancient, it is sacred, and it is still alive. Let no one convince you that royalty is something you must earn. It is something you must remember. Your ancestors did not walk through palaces so that their descendants would crawl through systems. They left a legacy that speaks through stone, through drum, through story, through skin. You are not far from greatness. It is your name. It is your birthright. So walk with your back straight. Speak with truth. Dress your mind in the knowledge of kings and queens, and carry the memory of your ancestors like a torch, burning not with anger, but with light. The light of dignity, the light of awareness, the light of purpose, because when the diaspora remembers who they are, the world will no longer define them by what they were made to suffer, but by what they were created to lead. Long before foreign ships cast their shadows on African shores, before the world saw Africa through the narrow lens of poverty or pain, there existed a radiant center of enlightenment, one so powerful that even today its echo refuses to fade. In the heart of Mali, along the curves of the Niger River, stood a city that challenged the ignorance of the world and gave light to the darkness of false narratives. That city was Timbuktu. To those who know only fragments of Africa's past, Timbuktu may sound like a myth, a forgotten name in dusty dustbits. But for those who seek truth, who long to uncover the buried brilliance of black civilization, Timbuktu is a revelation. It was more than a city, it was a sanctuary for knowledge, a holy ground of scholarship. Long before Europe stumbled into its own enlightenment, Long before universities like Oxford or Cambridge rose to prominence, black scholars, poets, astronomers, and theologians gathered in this desert jewel to exchange wisdom that had been passed down through generations. In its peak, the city held one of the world's greatest repositories of handwritten manuscripts, hundreds of thousands of them. These weren't just records of local affairs. These were complex studies in medicine, law, astronomy, philosophy, architecture, ethics, and mathematics. These were scrolls that engaged the divine and the scientific with equal reverence. They revealed a civilization not just surviving but leading. Timbuktu was part of a network of learning that extended across West Africa, with scholars traveling from distant lands to learn at its feet. Its institutions, like the fabled Sankore University, operated with a rigor and depth that rivaled any academic structure known to man. People came to be mentored, not only in worldly knowledge but in spiritual balance. Teachers were revered not just for what they knew but for how they lived. To be a scholar was to be a moral pillar, a cultural guardian, a servant of truth. This wasn't knowledge for pride, it was knowledge for purpose. It was the type of education that cultivated both heart and mind. Imagine a place where libraries were not built for the elite but as a public trust. Imagine a time when literacy in Arabic and indigenous languages was widespread and books were treated as sacred vessels. The people of Timbuktu didn't just collect books, they wrote them. Entire families dedicated their lives to copying text by hand, passing them to sons and daughters, ensuring that wisdom would never die, even if empires did. This was not passive learning. This was deliberate preservation. This was the defense of intellect in a world that would later try to deny black thought, black logic, and black brilliance. The scholars of Timbuktu were not isolated from the world. They were connected. They corresponded with thinkers in Morocco, Egypt, Persia, and even parts of Asia. This was global thinking born in the soil of Africa. It reminds us that the mind of the African was never closed. It was open, dynamic, and divinely curious. They observed the stars, they debated justice, they explored the mysteries of medicine, and they discussed the ethical frameworks of governance. Their questions were not small, and their answers were not shallow. They were deeply rooted in the belief that knowledge was sacred, something to be used to uplift communities and shape civilizations. To speak of Timbuktu is to challenge everything that has ever tried to define Africa in one dimension. This city, these people, these libraries are living proof that Africa was never waiting to be taught. It was teaching the world. The erasure of this legacy is one of the greatest tragedies in global education. When colonial systems invaded, they didn't just seek gold and land, they targeted memory. They targeted manuscripts, they burned books, looted libraries, and silenced the voices of African philosophers. And yet, even in the ashes, truth has a way of surviving. Hidden away in ancient trunks, buried under homes, protected by brave families, thousands of Timbuktu's manuscripts survived. And today they speak louder than ever. This matters not just as history but as identity. When a young person of African descent hears only about chains and suffering, they internalize limitations. But when they learn that their ancestors were authors of ancient science, protectors of profound philosophy, and stewards of spirituality, they begin to walk taller. They begin to think differently about what's possible. They understand that black intelligence is not a myth. It is a legacy, and that legacy did not begin in struggle, it began in sovereignty. Timbuktu is more than a word, it is a reminder that the intellect of Africa is not lost but hidden, not destroyed, but waiting for us to look beyond the headlines and dig into the heart of truth, waiting for us to teach our children that Africa gave the world more than minerals. It gave meaning, it gave vision. It gave knowledge that inspired minds long before the world called it relevant. This is the moment to reclaim it, not just for history's sake, but for the future's healing. Every library rebuilt, every manuscript translated, every story retold is an act of resistance against ignorance. It is a declaration that the mind of Africa is still alive, still vast, and still rising. Timbuktu lives on not just in desert sands, but in every soul that refuses to forget. In truth, the greatest ruins are not the buildings we've lost, but the knowledge we failed to remember. But if we listen, really listen, we will hear the pages turning again. We will hear the voices of our ancestors whispering wisdom through time, and we will know that we were never a people without thought. We were a people of thought before the world allowed itself to see, and now we must show it again, not with bitterness but with brilliance. Before the first whip cracked, before the first chain was fastened, a different kind of theft took place, one not of land nor of bodies, but of truth. The truth that black people were never born inferior. That lie, whispered for centuries, shouted in books, etched into laws, and buried deep in the systems of power, became one of the greatest manipulations in human history. But a lie, no matter how long it is repeated, does not become truth. And today we rise to expose it, not with rage alone, but with revelation. The belief in black inferiority was never based on fact. It was engineered, designed with precision, constructed to justify cruelty. And the more it was repeated, the more it was believed, not just by those who benefited from the lie, but by those who suffered under it. The greatest damage was not only the broken bodies, the stolen labor, or the scattered families. It was the mental blueprint handed down from generation to generation that said, you are less. That invisible weight has followed the children of Africa into every institution, every classroom, every courtroom, every workplace. It crept into mirrors and textbooks, into language and culture, until it shaped how people saw themselves and how the world saw them. But something happens when truth is uncovered. Something holy, something fierce. And that is what we are witnessing now, an unlearning, a remembering, a return. Because the narrative that black people were helpless, uncivilized, or incapable was not only false, it was fragile. It falls apart under the slightest pressure of honest history. The very presence of black civilizations, organized, intellectual, artistic, advanced, stands as a testimony that the lie was never real. From the structures of Nubia to the economic systems of Mali, from the leadership of African queens to the spiritual systems rooted in harmony with nature, there was depth, sophistication, and brilliance long before colonizers tried to redefine the story. The strategy was clear: erase the records, burn the libraries, silence the scholars, and then replace truth with caricatures. This was not accidental, it was strategic. Because when you convince a people they come from nothing, you make it easier to control their future. When you remove their roots, you remove their direction. And yet, even in the shadows, the truth remained. It passed through oral tradition, through names, through rhythms, through resistance. It survived the slave ships, the plantations, the prisons, the ghettos, and now it rises again, stronger than ever. Deconstructing the lie of inferiority is not just about history, it's about identity. It's about looking in the mirror and finally seeing the image of your ancestors, not as defeated, but as dignified. It's about removing the quiet shame that has lived in the background of so many lives and replacing it with knowledge that breathes freedom. Because once you know who you are, you stop accepting what you are told to be. You start building, you start leading, you start healing, not just for yourself, but for those coming after you. This truth is not just for black people, it's for everyone. Because when a lie infects the soul of a people, it corrupts those who believe it and those who spread it. Systems that rely on deception are unstable. A world that tells one group they are superior and another they are lesser will always be at war with itself. The work of deconstructing falsehood is not just restoration, it is liberation. It frees both the oppressed and the oppressor from the prison of ego and ignorance. It opens the door to a new kind of world, one built not on control but on truth. We must teach this truth. Speak it in homes, write it in books, show it in art, embed it in our institutions. We must challenge the distorted images, the erased contributions, the edited timelines, not to rewrite history, but to restore it, to fill in the deliberate gaps, to breathe life into the bones of forgotten greatness. The healing begins when we stop asking if black people deserve equality and start acknowledging that equality was never something they lacked. It was something they were denied. No more teaching children that their story begins in chains. Their story begins in light, in legacy, in leadership. Before they were enslaved, they were creators. Before they were colonized, they were sovereign. That knowledge is not a luxury. It is a right, and it must be returned. Because the lie of inferiority is not just historical, it is ongoing. It shows up in policy, in media, in opportunity gaps, in how pain is treated, and how genius is overlooked. But every time truth is spoken, a chain breaks. Every time a mind is awakened, a door opens. This is the time for collective awakening, not one built on blame, but on clarity, not to dwell in the past,
but to light the way forward. The journey of reclaiming self-worth is not easy. It requires confrontation, reflection, education, and determination, but it is necessary, because the cost of continuing the lie is far greater than the discomfort of facing it. We must remember that history is not neutral. It has been shaped by the hands of power, and now it must be reshaped by the hands of truth. And truth is not quiet. It speaks in the rising voices of those who will no longer be silent. It speaks in the confidence of those who know their worth. It speaks in the healing that comes when false narratives fall. And as it speaks, generations will no longer inherit shame. They will inherit strength. The chain was never just metal. It was the lie that tried to strip a people of their story. But truth is stronger. And now it breaks the silence. It breaks the distortion. It breaks the historical chain. And from that breaking, something greater is born. Dignity, clarity, power, not borrowed, but remembered.
Long before the world defined leadership through the lens of colonization, conquest, or corporate ambition, there existed a different kind of leadership rooted in legacy, spirituality, and an unshakable sense of responsibility to one's people. It was a leadership that didn't need validation from outside empires because it was already shaped by centuries of wisdom, tradition, and sacred order. This leadership wasn't born in boardrooms or battlefields alone. It was nurtured in the hearts of those who were entrusted with the lives, lands, and futures of their people. And at the center of that legacy stood black kings and queen mothers whose power, influence, and decisions echoed far beyond their lifetimes. These were not mythical figures. They were real, complex, and extraordinary. They didn't simply rule. They led with vision. They didn't only defend their territories, they cultivated prosperity, preserved knowledge, and uplifted culture. They knew that to lead was not just to command, but to serve. They bore crowns not only of gold, but of wisdom, responsibility, and spiritual depth. They walked in reverence, understanding that their strength came not just from their armies, but from their alignment with divine purpose and ancestral guidance. The world often speaks of leadership as if Africa had none until it was taught, but the record proves otherwise. Mansa Musa, emperor of Mali, did not wait for the world's approval. He ruled with such wealth, dignity, and generosity that his journey to Mecca altered entire economies. His leadership was not rooted in greed, but in giving. He used his resources to build schools, mosques, and libraries, creating centers of knowledge that empowered generations. His reign showed the world what it looked like when abundance met responsibility, when faith walked hand in hand with influence. Queen Nzinga, ruler of Ndongo and Matamba, stood in defiance of those who believed African women could be conquered or silenced. She was a strategist, a negotiator, a fierce warrior, and a symbol of resilience. Her intellect allowed her to navigate diplomacy with the Portuguese and protect her people from invasion. She taught us that leadership does not require compromise of self, that one can protect both identity and sovereignty with dignity and force. She led not by seeking approval, but by preserving freedom. And then there was Shaka Zulu, a leader whose military brilliance reshaped southern Africa. He revolutionized warfare, not to dominate blindly, but to unify fractured clans and build a stronger nation. He demanded discipline, innovation, and loyalty. His reign reminds us that strength and structure are not opposites, that great leadership includes order, precision, and a vision that extends beyond the battlefield into the very fabric of society. He did not simply wield power, he reshaped what it meant to be strong. Go back further still and you'll find Hatshepsut of ancient Kemet, a woman who ruled as pharaoh in a male-dominated society and did so with grace, intelligence, and architectural vision that still awees the world today. She expanded trade routes, strengthened temples, and commissioned monuments that stood not as symbols of ego, but as celebrations of culture and legacy. Her leadership teaches that gender was never a limit to greatness, and that true power is not loud, it is lasting. Each of these figures walked paths different from one another, yet their essence was the same. They understood that leadership was sacred, that it was more than dominion, it was stewardship. They knew the people's welfare was their reflection. Their reigns were not remembered simply because they ruled, but because they led with courage, wisdom, and conviction that inspired unity. And that is why their names remain. Their legacies were never meant to be buried beneath the noise of conquest or overshadowed by colonial narratives. These leaders were not footnotes in world history. They were authors of it. Their impact spread beyond borders, their philosophy shaped governance, and their examples still speak to us now, not in old language, but in living relevance. Their choices echo in every act of modern leadership that values service over status, courage over comfort, and community over control. This memory is vital. It is not just a matter of pride, it is a map, because when we remember who led us before we were taught to follow, we reclaim the ability to lead ourselves once again. When we remember that our ancestors built kingdoms, defended freedoms, and cultivated wisdom long before they were called slaves or subjects, we begin to see ourselves through the mirror of power, not pain,
The truth is, these stories were never lost. They were hidden, buried beneath generations of distortion. But the soil has shifted, the roots are showing, and from those roots rise new leaders. Leaders who carry the DNA of those ancient rulers, not just in blood, but in spirit, in clarity, in purpose. Because true leadership does not die, it transforms. It waits to be remembered, to be reignited, to be lived again in new voices, new bodies, new times. And so the call is not only to look back, but to rise up, to take the wisdom of those who led before and carry it into the present, to understand that power is not given, it is inherited through action, decision, and vision. We do not need to imitate the systems that erased us. We need only to remember those who shaped us. Their strength is still here, their courage is still needed, their lessons still live. They led with heart, they led with fire, they led with knowledge that leadership was not about being above others, but being rooted in something greater. They were not perfect, but they were powerful. And because they walked, we now run. Because they built, we now rise. Because they remembered who they were, we must never forget who we are.
Before maps were redrawn by foreign hands, before monuments were destroyed or repurposed under foreign flags, there stood a continent that had already mastered the art of design, construction, innovation, and sacred expression. That continent was Africa, not as the world was told to see it, but as it truly was. A place of unmatched beauty where minds shaped mountains and hands sculpted symbols that reached into the heavens. A land where architecture was not just structure but spirit, where every stone, every line, every curve told a story not only of function but of philosophy. From ancient cities to spiritual sanctuaries, the landscapes of Africa bore the fingerprints of brilliance. This was not chaos, not wilderness, not disorder. It was deliberate, organized, and visionary. The architecture of this land cannot be separated from its culture, its people, or its divine calling. For Africa did not build with the purpose of conquest. It built to connect. It built for the soul, for the generations, for the unseen as much as the visible. Its temples, palaces, pyramids, and homes were more than dwellings. They were declarations of identity and instruments of harmony. Consider the structures of Kemet, often referred to as ancient Egypt. These were not random formations in the desert. They were designed with celestial precision, aligned with stars, solstices, and the sacred knowledge of time and eternity. The pyramids were not simply burial sites. They were complex embodiments of life, death, resurrection, and divine order. The genius of these builders has stood for millennia without mortar, without modern tools, defying explanation, but rooted in ancestral mastery. These builders knew the language of the cosmos and used it to shape the earth beneath their feet. Travel south and west and the grandeur continues. In Sudan, the ancient Kushite kingdom built more pyramids than Egypt itself, each one a symbol, each one a witness to a civilization rich in culture, theology, and innovation. In Ethiopia, the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela defy gravity and logic, carved downward into the ground. Entire cathedrals formed from a single piece of stone. These were not just expressions of faith, they were marvels of engineering, carved in silence, preserved in reverence, and still standing in humble defiance of time. Venture further into the heart of the continent, and you'll find great Zimbabwe, a city of stone built without the use of mortar, its walls stretching with elegance and strength. A trading center, a royal seat, a testimony to a sophisticated society that thrived through commerce, agriculture, and spiritual life. It was built not to impress outsiders, but to sustain its own. Its towers, its enclosures, its layout spoke of intention and pride. This was a society that knew who it was and left its legacy in architecture as strong as its convictions. The artistic expression of Africa was not limited to the monumental. It lived in the designs of textiles, the etchings of pottery, the structure of villages, and the arrangement of marketplaces. Every design had a purpose. Every line carried meaning. Whether through the symmetrical planning of Yoruba cities, the sacred geometry found in Dogon villages, or the symbolic carvings in Ashanti stools, design was never random. It was coded with language, history, honor, and tradition, and it was passed down with care, not as decoration, but as identity. Africa was not waiting to be taught how to build, how to measure, how to create. It was already doing it. Its roads, bridges, irrigation systems, and waterworks served communities with wisdom, passed through time-tested innovation. These were not imitations of outside civilizations. They were original, rooted in understanding both natural law and human need. Harmony was the goal, not domination, not excess. African cities were laid out not only with defense in mind, but with the flow of life, of trade, of spirit. The people lived in rhythm with the seasons, with one another, and with the ancestors who guided their hands and hearts. The spiritual aspect of African design cannot be ignored.
Buildings were not merely shelters, they were vessels of presence, whether honoring ancestors, invoking divine forces, or hosting rituals that connected the physical and unseen realms. Space was treated with reverence. Art was more than beauty, it was breath. It told stories when voices were still. It carried meaning where written words were not needed. From the murals of Nubia to the masks of the Fang, from the bronze plaques of Benin to the rhythmic patterns of Ndebele homes, art was not for galleries, it was for life. Africa's creativity was not only spiritual, it was practical. It responded to climate, to community, to sustainability. African architecture respected the earth, used local materials, and considered airflow, sunlight, and shade long before it became fashionable in modern design. These were not poor solutions, they were wise ones. Solutions that still speak to our world today as it searches for sustainable ways of living. What was built in Africa before colonization did not crumble because it was weak. It was buried, ignored, or erased because it was powerful. Power that didn't need conquest to prove itself. Power that lived in the connection between design and destiny. The hands that built these worlds were not primitive, they were prophetic. And they still speak through the ruins, through the stories, through the beauty that refuses to be forgotten. The truth is, Africa was an architect of civilization, a maker of meaning, a builder of futures. And the memory of that craftsmanship lives on in every descendant who still dares to create, to innovate, to imagine. Because that brilliance was never lost, it was interrupted, and now it rises again.